It is Locked On Jazz for the 4th of May. The Utah Jazz season and review series continues, trying to discover what happened, why short of expectations, and today we look at leadership and camaraderie. A dataless conversation that generally makes me uncomfortable. We'll talk about it coming up on today's edition of Locked On Jazz. Pow.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
How are you? I'm David Locke, radio voice of the Utah Jazz, Jazz NBA insider. This is Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz, giving you insight, expertise, geeky numbers, and hopefully making it way better to be a Jazz fan each and every day. Thanks very much for tuning in and making Locked On Jazz your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. Let me remind you the goal of the week. We were trying to look back at the season and figure out what went wrong, I guess, is the way to say it, or just why the team fell short of expectations and where the front office, coaching staff, and players want to be. And I remind you that when I started the week, my thought was that rather than being able to pinpoint a single item, which is what we all want to do, the chances are we're not going to be able to do that. The chances are we're going to find multitude of things, and each is going to be 13 to 18 to whatever percent. So each day we're kind of presenting a new concept. And the idea is this part of the equation is really the way to look at this and see. Today I've gone live again. I did not go live earlier this week. I appreciate the live group. I do think the chat seems to be better if I'm not live and it all comes out at once and everyone joins in and can build off other things. So I'm going to keep an eye on that. But I think I'm going to move away from going live first thing each day for you. And then during the season, we'll go live with postcast and things. We'll see. But just a thought, if you have a user experience, for those of you who watch on YouTube, based on whether we're live or not, please let me know what your feeling on it is. All right. So today I wanted to look at leadership and camaraderie. And this one's hard because it's completely dataless. There's almost no way to prove it to be true. It's a lot of eye testy, esoteric kind of stuff. And I don't always buy it. I generally think, if you win a lot, then everyone gets along. And if you start to not win, then everyone doesn't. And then they say it's a leadership issue. And I never know which order these things happen. But if you look at the history of the Jazz, there are some interesting things here that make you kind of wonder whether there was a leadership and camaraderie issue. And you could kind of see it on the court, frankly. It wasn't the most joyful group that we've ever seen. The data points are that if they led by 10 in the second half of games, they were 43-13. And they won 77% of those games. And the league average was about 90. Okay, that's a big deal. Now, on the other end, we shoot the most threes of any team in the league, which would mean, I think, by definition, we have the highest variance of any team in the league. So that might be a little overblown. In the fourth quarters, we were 43-6 when we led by 10. We won 88%, and the league average was 94. So, again, we weren't, and we should be better than league average because you'd believe we're better than league average. But again, if that's one game or two games where the ball bounces in that sample size, it's all back to normal. And again, we probably should have more variance than most people. So I'm not entirely sure, again, where we're starting here. Okay, the other one that's interesting to me is this year we were 43-13 when we were ahead going into the fourth quarter. And the year prior, we were 45-2. What's interesting about, I found the most interesting about that all season long was the 43-15. We led, I believe, by more than any team in the league going into the fourth quarter. We led 58 of our games led going into the fourth quarter. I'm pretty certain that was the most in the league by a margin. Which again is so I'm not if the leadership and camaraderie is really terrible, are you really leading in that many games through 3 quarters? Our inability to close games. One, I do think it's a little overblown because of our variance, and two, um, in two, I do think there's something there, but could be talent, frankly, or roster builder, something of that nature. Not camaraderie, though. Hey, we have the Denver loss where when things got tough, we didn't react great, and we have the Clippers series loss where things got tough. So I guess I'm starting this one by saying it's really, really easy from the outside to say it's a leadership camaraderie issue that led to the season, and without any real facts, and no one really quibbles with you if you say it. And it's very hard to prove either way if it's true. And so I feel like this is kind of uncomfortable ground for me because I'm not sure it's true. It felt it though, right? Like the eye test, and when you're around the team, you saw it. So if we look at the history of the leadership, and I think there's two different things between camaraderie and leadership. Camaraderie is a togetherness, glue guys playing, like doing this. And the other part is leadership, who's leading the ship. And if you look back at the year in which Gordon Hayward was with us, he was not a leader. And when he left, actually the group kind of came together, it felt, in this. Now, and frankly, if Donovan wasn't great, then they would have come together and sucked. And then nobody would have talked about leadership. So I think Ricky Rubio was really this unique person who both was a leadership and camaraderie, as we talked a little bit on yesterday's show, who brought the team. And when he left and Mike came in, that left a leadership void. Mike is not a rah, get in your face guy. You heard the coaching staff this year during the COVID outbreak in January, when Mike's role became larger, how excited they were. Like that Mike's voice would become much more prominent when Donovan and Rudy were out, and how much they gave him accolades for that, which to me was like a plea to Mike of like, hey, when we come back at full strength, we need you to still do the same thing. And I just don't think that's who Mike is. He's a wonderful man. He's probably an incredible father and a neat husband because he seems to be very empathetic. And seems very real and bright. I don't know. Could be terrible, frankly. We don't know, but it seems that way. But he left a vocal leadership void when Ricky Rubio left. At the same time, Donovan and Rudy are rising up into importance, and they get an all-star experience, and they get that aspect of being an all-star, and they have some self-importance to them. And now they feel an ownership, and they feel as though they need to increase their voice, and they're not probably ready for that. And so what that led to, from an observer standpoint, was a much larger role for Quinn than most head coaches in the league. That the leadership for this team for many years after Ricky left and when Mike came in, and then going into the bubble, was Quinn. And then, you've heard Quinn talk about JC's role of kind of having this connective kind of feeling to him and this uniqueness and giving the team some swagger. If we go to the and just kind of bringing the group together in the bubble. Remember, this group's not in a great place when we hit COVID, and it's unsalvageable and all of that. And then they go to the bubble and they have this incredible experience and they bond and they come out of the bubble as a totally different team. And that carries them into the next season with all of this camaraderie and leadership being positive, also 52-20, right? Like when everything's rolling and they're winning every game, everyone says your leadership is fine. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing here. So, but that, I think there is something there that when Ricky left and Mike came, Mike didn't come in and say like, this is my team. Mike came in respecting Donovan and Rudy's rise, and then they make their first All-Star game, and it left a void on that group, and then all the COVID stuff, and that left another void. And I think Quinn becomes larger than maybe most coaches want to be, and maybe a little almost too large, as then when someone takes leadership and Donovan and Rudy want more leadership as time comes on, it's instead of Quinn, instead of a veteran player. It would be better if it was Mike having been a very dominant leader for 12 or 24 months, and then he kind of steps aside the way they talk about Jokic taking over Denver. It took a little while, and when Millsap first came, he stepped back and all sorts of things in Denver with that. This kind of leads to a funky little, and I think that might be a little bit of where we were this season, that you have two young guys in Donovan and Rudy, and we'll discuss them here in a second as leaders, and you have a pretty dominant head coach, and then simultaneously you lose your camaraderie figures. And I'll explain that as we continue. It's a Wednesday edition of Locked On Jazz. That's brought to you by our good friend Steve Carter and our friends over at Intercap Lending. Intercap Lending is a wonderful company. Brock Worthen and the crew over there do great work. Josh Romney bought the company and brought it back to Utah, and they've just grown and grown and grown. And why does a lending company grow? Because they get deals done. And then we have our own personal loan officer, Steve Carter. His number is 385-885-28. The reviews around Steve are just time and time again marvelous, and it's really great to be able to have someone we can send you to. It's our Locked On Jazz account with Intercap Lending, NMLS number 190465. You can get more information by visit intercaplending.com. You can just reach out to me if you'd like to, and email me at dlock09@gmail.com, and I'll set up a personal meeting with you and Steve. He's been just amazing to our Locked On users and listeners who've used him. It's been really one of my favorite parts about this is being able to send people to Steve and have that, and then get to know Steve personally. And he's just that true a guy. So go check it out. If you want to call, you don't want to get me involved, feel free to call Steve. Just make sure you tell him you're Locked On Jazz to get the corporate discount, 385-800-8528. That's 385-800-8528. Or email me first at dlock09@gmail.com. Today's show is also brought to you by our friends over at Built. What's the latest going on at Built? It's the new granola bar, the new experience from Built. 15 grams of protein on the chocolate peanut butter, the chocolate coconut, or grab the white chocolate. Is it white chocolate cherry? White chocolate berry. Oh, that's sold out. Oh, man, they just fly through these things. They're so good. Promo code is LOCKED15. They have the puffs right now, the churro, the coconut marshmallow, and the banana cream pie, plus the mint brownie, the raspberry, the peanut butter brownie, the coconut salted caramel cookies and cream, and coconut almond. And let me tell you, next time you see the brownie batter puff available, jump on it. It's just outstanding. So go check it out at built.com. Promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off. So the interesting one is Donovan and Rudy trying to become leaders on this team and feeling that it's their time and that's the rightful spot for them to do it. Donovan doing it now in his 5th year, and Rudy, I think, in his 8th. And you know what? They both try hard. They're both good guys, and they've both been at times not very good at it, right? Like, we've seen Rudy in his press conferences do things that we wish he wouldn't, and probably weren't the perfect. And Quinn said, hey, that's not the perfect time for that conversation and that way of doing things. Donovan is learning how to be a star and what it is to have your own shoe and to have all your own stuff and to have the agencies, CAA all around it and what all that means. And so we've watched those guys try to become leaders of their own brand essence while simultaneously leading a team. Pretty hard to do. And, again, very difficult without me being around every day, literally in every meeting and every communication, to know whether I can't judge them on how it was done. I've watched at times and been like, ugh, right? I think we've had cringe moments in which that's taken place. So then you have what I would call your camaraderie guys. And this is where I do think this year, and on the leadership stuff, I think it's hard to tell. This is where I do think this year was very different. And on the simplest terms, like, this team used to love to come to the arena and come to practice. And I don't know that they totally had that last year or this year. And I think a large part of that, again, maybe too easy, but was George Niang and Derek Favors' departures. George Niang really might be the best teammate in all of the NBA. I really am serious. He's the most enjoyable person I've ever been around. Every single player talks about it. When you listen to Philadelphia 76ers this year talk about how together they were and this and that, and everybody in the media immediately said, well, that's because there's no Ben Simmons. That's because there's George Niang. And that's truthfully how wonderful a guy George Niang really is. And losing George, I think, and adding Rudy Gay, who just doesn't have any experience winning. I mean, if we'd won a playoff series this year, it would have been Rudy Gay's first experience ever winning, who doesn't have the George Niang career trajectory going like this, but has the career trajectory going the opposite direction, where he's playing less than he's ever played before. He's less impactful than he's ever been. He's less engaged than he's ever been, whereas George is more impactful and more engaged. And I think, and is obviously fading as a player. It's just a really different dynamic there. The other one is Faves. And Faves had an element where everyone kind of knew he could play more and be more if he wanted to. But he was openly, willingly sacrificing and only playing 14 minutes a night. He wasn't even great at it. He was happy because he really likes it in Utah. His family was here. And it just created a little bit of hard to complain when this guy who could be playing 25 minutes a night, isn't complaining at all and is happy to be here. And that was a switch to Hassan, who really was still trying to play to prove himself. Hassan understood his role and accepted it. And it's super hard to do and deserves a lot of credit. But when he didn't get the time, or he was hot and he didn't get to stay in, which to Quinn's credit was consistent all year long, so there's no gray area, he was upset about it. You could see it on the bench. You could see it at different times during the season. He also was wildly moody, right? He's a box of chocolates that's doing this. Faves was like, zzz. So that transition from George Niang and Derek Favors to Hassan Whiteside and Rudy Gay, I think had a massive camaraderie issue. Immediately in the live chat room, someone brings up Joe. I've left Joe out here. I'd be super curious to actually ask Joe what he thinks on this. Joe, I actually think we missed Joe as a player, right? So the 44% three-point shooting of a year prior, the pick and roll game, his length defensively, I really think we missed Joe as a player. And but I don't think he was as connected this year. When he didn't get the extension to start the year, and then he wasn't extended and was worried about being traded, which he openly talked about. I don't know that I think that Joe is this same kind of total glue guy that I'm talking about in this regard. So Joe could disagree. I mean, I'm not saying he's not important to the camaraderie of the team. And frankly, I think Joe would admit that he can be a little he can be grumpy. Hopefully Joe would agree with that. But I think that I think we really miss Joe, the player. Whereas these two other guys, George and Derek, I thought brought a bonding roster to the team. And here's what's crazy about it. So on the other end, and I just compliment them immensely. Let's just also remember a few things about George. Our last time we had George, he's in a playoff series against the LA Clippers, and he couldn't have been worse. He shoots 2 of 13 from the field. He shoots 1 of 10. He has 5 turnovers in 59 minutes. He's coming off a series where he shot 34% against Memphis. The game looks really, really fast, and he looks out of sorts. And he's a free agent, and he signs a 2-year, $7 million contract with Philadelphia, where he was making 1.7 with us. And at the time, it felt as though that was a lot, right? It felt as though, he wasn't ready for the playoffs. He had a tough time, both offensively and defensively. And the decision was made to go use that money instead and sign Rudy Gay on what's a 3-year deal for all intents and purposes at $19 million. That's too bad. Like, that's turning out, one, because Rudy Gay didn't play in the playoffs, which you never would have suspected. And two, that's turning out to, that's a lot more expensive. George was unbelievable in the Toronto series. He shot 70%. He was amazing. He shot 12 of 18 from three. He has not started in the first game of the Miami series, which is very similar to the Clippers series, where you like him, right? He was 0 of 7 the other night. Let's see. There was a limit to who, like, you believe George was as a player. He keeps rising up, and his camaraderie is unbelievable. There's no question that losing George had a huge impact on this season, maybe the biggest impact of anything. And the change to Rudy Gay was just at a different place in his career. And a Frank that we paid more for, it's not great, right? That's if you're looking for pieces of this puzzle, that's a lot. Then there's Faves, who, honestly, he wasn't great for us. And we paid him $9 million a year. And when you're in the luxury tax, you can't have a backup center that's making $9.3 million or $9.7 million a year with a player option. Unfortunately, it cost us a first-round draft pick to get off that contract. So that's the reality, that when you pay Rudy at 35 or 38 or whatever it is, that you're going to have a minimum backup center. But the fact is that, so you move from 9 million to 1 million. You just had to do that. The unfortunate part is you had paid the 9 million to Faves along the way and ended up with, having to give up a first round draft pick to get off that contract. But there's no question that those two guys had an element and a camaraderie and a togetherness to this roster. And then back to the leadership conversation, the leadership of young Donovan and Rudy were not capable of bringing that same juice that George and Derek brought to the group when you added characters like Rudy Gay and Hassan Whiteside and then Daniel House later. You just had a very different mix and match of what the team is. So I think that that's an interesting. All right, we'll continue on this. Take some of your thoughts and your questions from the live room, add that to the program. But those are kind of the two things. And then I have a thought for you moving forward on the idea of camaraderie and leadership as we continue. Thanks very much for making Locked On Jazz your first listen of the day. Locked On NBA Big Board is our NBA draft show. Rafael Barlow leading the way. Also Richard Stamen, Sam Ferris, Leaf Tulane, all there for you with player rankings, more, and getting you ready for the NBA draft at NBA Big Board. So the good thing to me on this leadership camaraderie issue, there's two questions. One is you have to decide as you're building the team going forward. First thing you have to decide is how much do you think this is part of the equation? We'll throw that in as a poll question over on the YouTube chat over there. There's a poll question. Was this 0 to 10? Was this 10 to 20? Was this 20 to 30? Was this 30 to 40? Was this 40 to 50? Like, what percentage of the reason the season fell short was leadership and camaraderie? And so obviously the first question you have to figure out is how much of the noise around Donovan and Rudy is real. Second question is, do you believe Donovan and Rudy can lead you moving forward as your primary leaders? Are they capable of that, or can you help them get there? And I think that's the question. Is it possible to bring in a dominant personality that actually leads those two? I don't think so, actually. So my quick answer to that is maybe no, that's not possible. To add a new person in who suddenly takes the leadership gamut from these two guys, unless it's a really dominant player and it's a total rebuild of the roster, probably moving one of these two to get that type of player. So my first answer to that is no. So then the second question you better answer is, if Donovan and Rudy are your primary guys, are they going to be able to mature into a capable leader for your franchise moving forward? And then the next part is rebuilding the George Niang, Derek Favors aspects of a roster, I think can be done pretty easily, frankly, with some effort, but can be done. And I think there's an element of both Donovan and Rudy. I have just great belief in who both of them are. That Rudy Gay is not going to be taking guidance from Donovan in any way, shape, or form. And so how's Donovan going to lead Rudy Gay? Right? Like, that's probably not. How's Rudy Gobert leading Hassan Whiteside, who, frankly, whether this is true or not, thinks he's probably as good as Rudy Gobert, right? He thinks he should be playing. He understands the situation. He thinks Sacramento screwed him. He's trying to revitalize his career. He's trying to get another contract, and he believes that he should be an NBA starter. Like, he's not had Tony Bradley been our backup center this year, and Rudy Gobert is able to lead him still, and they're been their 5th year together, and Bradley's kind of on that career trajectory, ascent the right way. Maybe, Trent Forrest, you watch Donovan with Trent Forrest, that seems like a pretty positive relationship. Can you find more guys that actually let Donovan and Rudy lead more than maybe otherwise? I don't think George and Derek, in the case I'm talking about, needed to be led in any way. They brought the group together. George just had this incredible personality to him. Joe certainly wasn't being led by them. And should you bring in guys who actually do need to be led by them and you give them a chance for leadership? Like, there's a whole discussion here of whether or not this roster actually was one that Donovan and Rudy could lead. Do you need to make Quinn have less of a prominent role leading? It's hard for a head coach to, and I think we saw that after winning 52-20, talked about this throughout the year, like there's just not a lot of room by which he could, whip up the whip and get the horse going during the regular season after going 52-20, and kind of had to coerce them to get to the finish line. And then they never jumped in that regard. So, I think that when you kind of put all these pieces in this puzzle together, it's crazy hard to do. There's also a whole discussion of like, as someone's asking, like, is Don a player that's the first option on a championship team? Monday's show is a little bit like, what's the realistic reality of what this group as one can come together and be? Like, were we around short? Do we really think that we're a Western Conference Finals team? Do we think we're an NBA Finals team? Do we think we're an NBA championship team? There has to be some realistic kind of aspect of that. Also. Here's a comment from the chat room that's good. You don't have to have the best player to lead the locker room. Dallas leader on the court is Luka, but it sometimes has to be discussed in the locker room. If something else, Powell and Dorian Finney-Smith are our locker room leaders. I think so. And as time goes on, by the way, Luka better become that guy. Like, it's going to be an issue for Dallas if Luka doesn't become that guy over time. He's only in his 3rd season right now. But I think the point is true that your best players don't have to be that guy. We didn't have that. And so, maybe that's George and Derek, who everyone's going to listen to because they're on who they were. We didn't have any Dwight Powell. Hassan Whiteside's not capturing that locker room with his personality. Rudy Gay is certainly not capturing that locker room with his personality along the way, particularly when he came off injured and didn't play off the heel surgery for the first 35 games. So, I think that, so I think that's an interesting, here's the mix, juice, camaraderie, all of that with fun speculation. Mine is that Faves made Rudy more tolerable, which in turn made Don happier. Sure. Who knows, right? We don't know these things. But I think that is there an example of foreign player being a vocal leader of the team? I think Ricky Rubio. I think Ricky Rubio is just a natural born leader. It's why everyone loves him so much. It's why every front office loves him so much. And then, but the fact is, I think his game is a little too limited to be able to carry you to the heights you want to go in the process. With that, Jazz 113, I really struggle reconciling knowing Quinn is a great coach and leader versus no. Yeah, I mean, I think that coaches can have good years versus not as good years. I think there's a chance this group, to a little bit of our conversation here, I think this group as it formed with Don and Rudy as the leaders, without the camaraderie pieces of George and Derek and Joe, however you want to fit him into this group, I think Joe as a player is what we really missed. And Boyan's not a leader and Mike's not a leader. That you ended up with a team that I think was very hard to, considering their past history, very hard to coach and bring forward. Whereas the previous year, he like rebuilt them in the bubble. They came out of the bubble juice. They had that going, and then it all went well in a crazy year of COVID, and he carried it through. The other thing I do think that we just haven't talked about here is the stress of January may have just broken this team. And that there's some interesting data points we'll talk about tomorrow. We'll touch on that tomorrow. The COVID stress of January and then playing with and without Donovan and Rudy and that whole thing. And then actually on the court, things just never clicked back in. Like I'll share this note with you tomorrow more in detail, but Donovan and Rudy were like the number one pick and roll combination in the NBA through February. And then all of a sudden weren't. Like then in the most bizarre, weird fashion, from March on, Donovan and Rudy ranked 61st out of 100. And then going into the final game of the playoffs, they were 69th out of 78. Like all of a sudden, that which was number one in the NBA stopped working, which is weird. And I don't know why. All right. It is Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Thanks very much for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, go check out NBA Big Board and get ready for the draft with all those guys, or your daily podcast, Locked On NBA.